ELISA is another technique that's used to detect the presence of antigens in a sample and can be used to determine the concentration of antigen in any given sample. In general, to perform an ELISA first, you need to immobilize your sample, usually on a well plate. Then, you wash the well plate to make sure only the immobilized parts of your sample remain. To check for binding of certain molecules, a reporting enzyme is added to the plate, which will allow us to check for the presence of our molecule of interest. There are three main types of ELISA that we're going to cover: direct, indirect, and sandwich. First, we'll go over direct ELISA. In direct ELISA, the antigen of interest is immobilized on a surface, usually a well plate. Then a liquid containing the primary antibody is washed over the surface, and if the antigen is present, the antibody will bind to it. The antibody is connected to an enzyme that will create a color change if the antibody has bound to the antigen, which will alert us to the binding. Next, we have indirect ELISA. In indirect ELISA, we again place the antigens in the wells and wash it with a solution containing antibodies for the antigen. Then we wash it again with a second antibody that will bind to the first antibody. The second antibody is connected to an enzyme that will create a color change if binding occurs, thereby alerting us to the presence of the antigen. And finally, we have sandwich ELISA, which is like the previous two techniques, but it also allows us to tell how much antigen is present. In sandwich ELISA, we already know the antigen is present and will bind to the antibody, and it'll be sandwiched between those two antibodies. This time, the antibody is immobilized on the surface instead of the antigen. Then the solution that may contain the antigen is washed over the surface and allows the potential antigen to bind to the antibody. Next, a second wash containing antibodies for the antigen is washed over, and those antibodies will bind to the antigen if it's present. This second antibody is connected to an enzyme that will lead to a color change if binding occurs. The stronger the color, the more of the secondary antibody has bound, indicating higher levels of the antigen. So to recap, we have three types of ELISA. First is direct, where the antigen is attached to the well, and antibodies with enzymes attached are washed over it to see if the antigen of interest is present. The second type is indirect, where a second antibody is washed over to see if it binds to the first antibody. And finally, we have sandwich ELISA, where the antibody is fixed to the surface and a sample that may contain the antigen of interest is washed over the surface before another solution containing a second antibody with the reporter enzyme is washed over the surface to see if it binds to the antigen. The antigen would be sandwiched between those two antibodies.